Now, it's my great privilege to introduce the first speaker of today, Dr. Thomas Renard from Belgium. Dr. Thomas Renard is a senior research fellow at the Ahmed Institute. His research focuses on counterterrorism and counter-radicalization in Belgium and in Europe. His recent research has focused on the evolution of counterterrorism policy in liberal democracies since 2001, on returning foreign fighters and on radicalization in prison and on terrorist recidivism. Now, Dr. Thomas Renard, I'll just leave the floor for you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. And first of all, I'm very grateful to Repatriate Children Denmark for having invited me to be here with you today. In my presentation, I was asked to present some facts, perhaps some figures, but also to present some of the main challenges and dilemmas that this issue is presenting to European governments. And first of all, perhaps, let me start with some facts. It is not the first time that European governments are confronted with this issue of foreign fighters, jihadis, and families, and with the issue of repatriation. But never, really never in history were we confronted with a crisis of this magnitude. So it's not entirely new, but it's clearly unprecedented in this magnitude. Because we're talking about over 600 European children that are still detained to this day in northeast Syria by the Kurdish administration. Essentially, the majority of them are in those camps since 2019 after the fall of Baghouz. But some of them have been there in those camps since 2017 already. Here is another key fact, I think. Children are victims. Children are the victims of the choices of their parents. They're victims of war. They're victims of inhuman conditions in those camps. And they're victims of the inaction, of the unwillingness or inability of their governments to extract them, to get them out of those camps. These children should never have been there in the first place, and they should certainly not remain there to this day. And yet, there they are, as we have seen in the movie. They are still there in spite of constant calls from families, from NGOs, from civil society, from journalists, in spite of calls from security services or anti-terrorism magistrates across Europe, in spite of court decisions that have repeatedly ruled in favor of the repatriation of their children, in spite of the recognition by the governments themselves, by European governments themselves, that these children have the right to return, and yet they're still not back. Why is it then? What I want to highlight here is perhaps three different sets of reasons. Political reasons, legal and practical reasons, and eventually security reasons. According to several polls in different countries in Europe, public opinion seems generally, perhaps overwhelmingly, against repatriation, even against the repatriation of toddlers. This has led to fears about the electoral toxicity of this issue. Political suicide, some say, particularly when elections are around the corner, and not least given the fact that in many European countries, populist parties, far-right parties are increasingly popular and therefore put pressure on moderate, progressive parties. Yet I strongly believe, that governing is not just doing what is popular, it's also doing what is right and what is best for the country. And repatriation, I believe, might be a case of good policy, bad politics. And to quote Churchill, who was not known for being a soft-hearted person, nothing can be more abhorrent to democracy than to imprison a person or keep him in prison because he is unpopular. This is really the test of civilization. The repatriation of children does not only pose a political dilemma, but also legal and moral ones. And in this regard, a fundamental issue has been the fate of children, and the fact that the fate of children has become largely intertwined with that of their mothers, as states basically remain largely unwilling to repatriate men and women, as we know. And most governments seem to condition repatriation to separation. Yet, the separation of a mother and a child can be considered, to say the least, legally and morally problematic. Can it be done? Can it be done without the consent of the mother? Can it be done even with the consent of the mother? Can it be forced, and under which circumstances? What, in the end, is the best interest of the child? The issue of separation presents very profound dilemmas for the governments, of course, but also, and more fundamentally, for the families and for the mothers. What choice do they actually have? What situation are we putting them in front of? And do we actually need to put them in front of that choice? Because as a matter of fact, the arguments in favor of a repatriation of the children with their mother, the arguments against separation abound. Separation, psychologists, experts tell us, separation is likely to trigger additional traumas to these children, and that may actually hinder their chances of a successful resocialization. Separation can be considered unnecessary because security services tell us that most of these women were already defectors of ISIS in a process of de-radicalization, in a process of disengagement, or at the very least that they present a relatively low threat to our societies. It is a matter of fact that the Kurdish administration so far seems unwilling to tolerate repatriation of the children without the mother, so would not allow for a separate repatriation. And as a matter of fact, then, it is simply easier, given that fact, not to separate the children from their mothers. Not least, and I think this is an argument that is often overlooked, not least if we consider that most of these women will return to Europe sooner or later. So why not repatriating them already? It seems, for all we know, that the Kurds may not be able to prosecute these women. So if not now, in 1 year, in 2 years perhaps, we will be confronted again with the decision of what to do with these women. So again, why not repatriating them now with their children? So while the decision to repatriate or not is one thing, it should not be, went a little bit too fast. That's the problem when you follow notes. To conclude on this part, let's remember that the absence of decision is a decision in itself, with very concrete consequences. And without a shift of policy from European governments or from Kurdish authorities, children remain and will remain stranded and at risk in those camps. Now, it should not be entirely dismissed, indeed, let's be realistic, that governments are facing very concrete difficulties, not only the dilemmas that I have presented, but also in operationalizing a repatriation policy. And that should be recognized. It's still a zone of war. There's still conflict in the region. There's still armed groups active. Hence, a repatriation mission is risky. The deteriorating situation in the camps complicates the localization and identification of the children, of the families to repatriate. Confirming filiation and nationality of the children, providing them with the papers, also requires additional effort. Negotiating with the Kurdish authorities is complicated. It is a non-state entity with no international status. There is no diplomatic representation, no consular services in the region. That also complicates things. Yet at the same time, and this being said, 84 European children have already been repatriated from Syria. 84 European children. So it can be done. As a matter of fact, many other countries have done so in much higher numbers. And waiting longer, several months, several years, is clearly not going to make things easier. So again, why not now? And finally, the security argument. Issues of national security are often used to counter the arguments of repatriation. National security is often put as if it were above the best interest of the child. Children, in some cases, are presented as ticking time bombs. Ticking time bombs, as some heads or former heads of intelligence services have been heard saying. But again, here is a fact. Between 200 and 250 European children have already returned to Europe since 2012, in addition to those who have been actively repatriated. Many of them suffer from multiple traumas, and their resocialization here in Europe is challenging in many regards. Let's be honest about this. But we haven't heard of a major incident. We haven't heard of any time bomb yet, as far as I'm aware. In contrast, it is hard to see how abandoning children in these camps is not the actual policy that is creating time bombs. And in conclusion, I strongly believe that European governments have the legal and moral responsibility to repatriate European children with their mothers. Failing to do so is undermining our principles and international commitments, as well as making us less safe over the longer term. I will stop here because I was said that we can have some questions as well, so I can happily answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Now, I think I'll just take a couple of questions myself first. You were quite precise when you said that it can be done, I believe you said. But also you mentioned that there is this huge opinion against it in many countries. So where do you see the solution?
Well, as I said, I think this can be a case of good policy, bad politics. So governing sometimes is about taking some decisions that might be unpopular. I don't think raising taxes is ever popular, yet governments keep doing it, right? So I think governments can take decisions that are unpopular. Now, let me perhaps emphasize one point. I think it might be more complicated in some countries than others, depending on the electoral context. Belgium recently, like Denmark, changed its position with regard to the repatriation of children. So Belgium has announced, the Prime Minister in March, that it will repatriate the children and a number of mothers from Syria. And one of the reasons for that, I believe, I'm quite convinced, is because we had a new government and because the next election is quite far on the horizon. So the government probably came to the conclusion that it needed to be done. And if they were to do it, they would rather do it early in the policy cycle, so that basically they would not have to bear the consequences, the political consequences of their choice closer to the election. So I would strongly believe that First of all, it needs to be done, and if you have the possibility to do that early in your policy cycle, it's probably a good political calculus. In France, to take the other example, in France with presidential election around the corner next year, this will inevitably, I think, prove more challenging.
So what caused this shift in public opinion in Belgium? I'm curious about that.
Well, there hasn't been a shift in the public opinion. There hasn't been a poll done in Belgium. There were polls done in France, in the Netherlands notably. So we don't know. We can only assume in Belgium that the public opinion probably, like in France, like in Netherlands, is relatively opposed to the repatriation of children and certainly to the repatriation of adults. But as I said, we have a new coalition government since October last year. Some parties in that government have always been in favor of the repatriation. Some countries were part of the previous government that refused that repatriation. But I think they came to the conclusion that this is an issue that whether they want it or not will come back to them. If they don't take the decision now, today, most likely they will be confronted to difficult choices in 6 months from now, in a year, in 2 years from now. So it's better to proactively take a decision and to do it early again in the policy cycle rather than waiting longer. But again, this is just at the political calculus level, of course.
In Denmark, we have seen a shift in public opinion, at least when it comes to the children, especially after reports came out that it actually posed a bigger security threat for the state of Denmark to leave the children in camps and possibly being cups, as it was said, for ISIS there. And that sort of changed public opinion, and the Danish government were moved to do something. Is this typical, that it is securitization that sort of moves the politicians to do something?
I'm actually a little bit doubtful about that.
Okay.
Because we have seen in a number of countries, we have seen in the UK, in Belgium, in Netherlands, in France, in Germany, for the past 2 years already, we have heard heads of intelligence services, former heads of intelligence services, anti-terrorism judges, a whole series of actors that really are, I would say, quite credible voices when it comes to assessing the risk of these individuals. And we have heard say that basically it was safer to repatriate everyone, including women, including men, to prosecute them in Europe, to detain them in Europe, and to work on their de-radicalization, disengagement, and rehabilitation safely into the society. But in spite of these relatively powerful voices that were presenting this argument through the security lens only, they were not mentioning moral arguments, they were not mentioning legal arguments, just specifically on the security arguments, they said it's safer to repatriate everyone rather than abandoning them in those camps, because then you cannot monitor them, you cannot keep track, you're dependent on what the Kurds will decide to do with them. There's always the risk of evasion, there's always the risk that they disappear and could reappear someday in Europe with bad intentions. So these services have built the case for over 2 years now that we should repatriate everyone. But that hasn't helped, that hasn't been enough to convince the governments of Belgium, Netherlands, France, or the UK to change their position. So I think it's really a whole series of different reasons. You have to put together the security reasons, the legal reasons, the moral reasons, the political calculus, and of course, the work that civil society organizations like RTC Denmark, journalists, the coverage in the press of these issues, all of that plays together. It's not one or the other, it's really all of this together that puts pressure to some extent on European government, and at some point may trigger the shift in the policy.
Okay. Thank you, Thomas, for an extremely interesting speech. I believe that we are running, we have a sort of tight schedule here. So what I'll do is I'll open for questions in the afternoon. We'll have discussions there, and there'll be a possibility to ask Thomas questions as well. But I'm a bit fearful that if we start this now, we will lose track of time very, very quickly. But thank you very much for coming. And personally, I just say that there is some hope in that, isn't there? That politicians can actually make unpopular decisions, isn't there?
I would hope that they can, because otherwise it's not good government.
Okay. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.